My name is Jill. My husband, Ted, and I had been married and living in Charlottesville ever since we were 18-year-old college freshmen. I had never been with anyone other than Ted, and I remained faithful to him. Until this summer. At 5 foot 3 inches tall and 140 pounds, I was your average suburban housewife. Ted and I were intimate about once a week. We are empty nesters, and with our children being grown and out of the house, I had expected more. It wasn't that I was unhappy, it's just that things between us had become stale and routine. One day, my sister, Ashley, called and asked me for a favor. My nephew Connor had decided to attend college at Tech. Ashley wanted to know if Connor could spend the summer with us to familiarize himself with the town before moving into the dorms in August. I asked Ted if it would be okay, and he replied, "Of course, Connor can stay with us." Connor arrived the first week of June. At 18 years old, he was the picture of masculinity. We have a pool, and he loves using it. On one occasion, I peeked out of the den window and saw him in all his glory. He looked like a model with his 6-foot-plus height, sandy blonde hair, and chiseled but yet muscular physique. My peek turned into a stare, and when he caught me looking at him, I shamefully looked away. What was I doing? He was only 18 and he was my nephew. The next day I was cleaning the house and went into Connor's room. A pair of Connor's underwear were in the hamper. I picked them up and imagined how good he'd look in them up close and personal. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, so I dropped the underwear and hurried out of the room. The footsteps had been Connor's. He was coming back to his room from the shower. He was wearing a towel around his waist. I could hardly look him in the eye. As we passed, I looked back at him. I couldn't believe what I saw. As Connor entered his room, he was taking off his towel, and I caught a glimpse of his backside. Afterwards, I was so keyed up that I didn't know what to do with myself. Ted was out, so I rushed into my bedroom, shut and locked the door, and promptly began to relieve my stress. I couldn't get the vision of Connor out of my mind. In the coming days, I became more and more infatuated with Connor and curious about his body. I was disgusted with myself because of what I was thinking and doing. I was constantly trying to get glimpses of Connor's body. Worse yet, on a daily basis I was going into his room, laying on his bed and looking for his underwear. I was becoming addicted to Connor. I found myself lying in bed at nights, next to my husband, dreaming about Connor. I also found myself, during the infrequent times my husband and I were intimate, thinking about Connor. No, that wasn't quite accurate. I wasn't just thinking about Connor, I was wishing he was somehow the one in bed with me. One particular night after a short session with Ted, I lay awake thinking again about Connor. I slowly crept out of my bed, while being careful not to wake Ted. Quietly, I walked across the hall to Connor's room. I quietly opened the door to discover that Connor was asleep. I crept into his room. Suddenly, Connor moved. I got out of the room as fast as I could and back into my bed. The entire next day I was fully disgusted with myself. However, once again that night I found myself lying awake and thinking of Connor. Despite my disgust with myself, I found myself once again making the journey across the hall to his room. I peered in the door and found that Connor was lying on his side with his back to me. This time, however, the sheet was down to his midsection. His snoring signaled that I could enter his room undetected. I wanted to see more of his body, so I carefully pulled down the sheet. I found him wearing tight white underwear that clung to that muscularity and his masculinity. I started to walk around the bed to view his front side, but he started to move, so I got out of the room as quickly as possible. Back in my own bed, I couldn't sleep. I was so turned on. I tried to relieve myself but couldn't. I tossed and turned for probably 20 minutes until my curiosity got the best of me again, and once again I headed for Connor's room. I peeked in and saw that Connor was now lying on his back. The sheets were down below his knees where I had early placed them. Quietly, I approached Connor. I looked down at his body again. I had to touch him. And I did. I must have been a sight to behold, standing there in my undergarments touching my nephew. I was getting lost in my lust for him. He didn't move or let on that he knew what I was up to. He didn't have to. All of a sudden he tensed up and shuddered. Realizing what I had made him do, I ran from his room. This time I didn't go back to my bedroom. I peeked into his room again, and standing right there in his doorway, I had one of the best stress-relieving sessions of my life. It was absolutely incredible. The next morning, Connor's reaction to me changed. He was much more enthusiastic and more attentive to me. Oh my God. What did I do? I said to myself. I became terrified that he was not asleep last night when I touched him. Because of that, I forced myself to stay away from his room at night for more than a week. Just because I stayed away doesn't mean I didn't think of Connor. I still lay in bed at night thinking of his young muscular physique. The next time that Ted and I were intimate, I was desperate to reach the mountaintop. It had been nearly 10 days since we had a session, and while I was with Ted, all I could think about was Connor. In 15 minutes we were done. And in true Ted form, he rolled over, went to sleep, and started snoring. I was in agony, and before I knew it, I found myself making the trip down the hall to Connor's room. Peeking in, he appeared to be asleep, so I crept inside. His snoring encouraged me to once again approach him. I carefully removed the sheets that covered him. This time he was sleeping on his side. I once again touched him. After a few seconds, I looked back up to make sure Connor was still asleep. My heart literally flip-flopped inside me as I discovered Connor looking back at me.
I was hoping you would come back, Aunt Jill.
Connor whispered. I couldn't believe my ears. Connor had been awake the last time I was in his room. Please don't tell Ted. I begged him as I was pulling away.
I won't tell.
Connor responded as his hand reached out and took my hand.
Please stay.
I sat down on his bed and I began to give Connor my undivided attention. I was on fire and I hadn't felt this way in years, if ever. Connor reached the mountaintop. This is wrong. We can never do this again, I told him.
Please relax. Don't be angry, Aunt Jill.
Connor pleaded.
This was just between us.
The next day was a Saturday. I was home in the morning while Ted was working a half day at his office. Connor didn't come out of his room until around 11:30. There was an awkward silence between us as neither one of us really knew what to say. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful. I filled it doing housework and running errands. We all hung out in the den and watched movies, and Ted and I decided to go to bed around 11:30. Connor made it a point to tell us that he was going to bed soon too. Ted couldn't see Connor's face, but he kissed at me and smiled. I slightly shook my head no, but even though I shook my head no to Connor, I knew better. As soon as Ted was asleep, I found myself in Connor's bed. Clearly, Connor knew I would be there as well because this time he didn't act like he was asleep, and I couldn't help myself. He had become my drug. And like any addict, I had to have my fix. I gave him my undivided attention. As I was about to leave, he held me by the hand and asked,
Do you have to leave? I'd like to give you my due diligence as well.
I thought for a moment, and then I sat back down. I knew I needed to leave, but I was on fire and my hormones were screaming stay. Of course my flesh won. I stayed, accepted his offer, and it was wonderful. Connor and I were hooked. We continued to offer each other some form of attention every night for the next week. The next Friday night we broke the routine. Or at least, I broke the routine. That night in bed, Ted wanted my attention, but I declined. Once he went to sleep, I wanted to go to Connor, but was torn with guilt for refusing my own husband. I lay awake for hours feeling dreadful about my husband while wanting Connor's undivided attention. On Saturday morning, Ted went into the office for a half day of work. I stood alone in the kitchen, feeling horribly conflicted over the illicit yearnings for my young nephew. Last night I didn't give any attention to my husband or Connor, and now my body was begging for attention. And there was only one man in the house that could offer any, and that was Connor. I looked at myself in the mirror. Then I walked down the hall and into Connor's room. Connor was asleep. I cuddled up against him. Connor immediately awoke and turned to face me. He knew what I wanted, and he obliged. I still felt bad for denying Ted, but I also felt a sense of urgency. This would be Connor's last weekend with us before moving into the dorm on Monday. What was I going to do without him? Like an addict that knew they were about to be cut off, I was determined to get as much of my drug as I could. We paid attention to each other Saturday morning, Saturday night, and Sunday night. Monday we dropped Connor off on campus. I told him that he was more than welcome to come over on the weekends to get a free meal. He smiled and said,
"You know I will, Aunt Jill."
I had never cheated on my husband. And while a part of me hates myself for what I have done, there's another part of me that's unrepentant at all because that part had never experienced anything like what I experienced with Connor.